Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. A very warm welcome to all of you. A very warm welcome to all the new subscribers and for those of you who have been with me since the start. Again, this is a topic many of you guys have been asking me about for a long time. So I've decided to bring it all together. So, with that, let's delve right in. All right. Why stabilizing union after our divine masculine's return is the real work of twin flames? All right. So, that's why I've titled it that way. How, when your divine masculine returns, how you actually stabilize union. So, when our beloved divine masculine returns, it is rarely a simple coming back. It's not just about physical presence, but the energetic convergence of timelines. In my own journey, his return was not marked by romantic gestures, but by the quiet collapse of resistance within his field. You know, separation phases, ego defenses. My divine masculine reached a point where the very illusions he clung to began to dissolve. That's the reason why often the return out of our divine masculine is merely not an accident. It's not accidental. It comes after deep purging cycles, retrograde seasons, that expose things that are not serving either you or your divine masculine, and countless energetic tests that forces your divine masculine to confront what he has been running from, the inevitability of union with his beloved divine feminine, divine wife. That's why our divine masculine's return is often reflected as reactivation, remembering that no amount of avoidance could ever erase. So let's talk about the first stage of re entry, the shock and the testing. So when our divine masculine first reappears, there will be shock in the body. Both you and your DM. Our nervous system doesn't simply relax into union after years of energetic push and pull. So, our divine masculine's initial re entry will test your inner stability. My divine masculine's initial re entry tested my inner stability. So that's why you got to ask yourself this question. Would you collapse into old patterns of chasing validation, or would you hold the union frequency regardless of your divine masculine's action? So often our divine masculine will test waters with subtle cues, gauging if the field is safe, if you are ready, if as the divine feminine, if we are ready. Do we still embody resentment, or are we still angry, or are we pissed off, or are we going to bring up the past, or if we had anchored into neutrality, the 0 point state. So this stage is always delicate, because our divine masculine often tends to oscillate between stepping forward and retreating, but the oscillation itself is proof of his return to the field. And that's why the stabilization phase, oh boy, the third energy grounding, union, excuse me. Union does not stabilize through romance alone. It stabilizes through the third energy, the shared soul frequency that requires both you and your divine masculine to hold your polarity without collapse. So in this phase, what we begin to do is to consciously or unconsciously build energetic scaffolding. Number one, communication without collapse. In the past, you would always notice you're always collapsing after communication, right? So, communication without collapse, learning to exchange words and presence without triggering past cycles. At this stage, I'm just going to do a mic test because it happened the last time I was trying to record and nothing came. I'm just gonna. Okay. And nothing came. Perfect. So, communication without collapse, learning to exchange words and presence without triggering past cycles. Secondly, sacred anger integration, allowing your wounds of abandonment and rage to be felt without projecting them onto your divine masculine. This is very, very important. That's why the release that you have weeks before union is a sign. Thirdly, energetic mirroring, recognizing that when he wavered, it was often reflecting a subtle insecurity or imbalance within him. The third energy acts as a stabilizer. It's the field that catches both you and your divine masculine when your human selves wobble. So, for example, right? Often our divine masculine's written often is followed by old wounds resurfacing, certain trigger phrases, if example, your DM blocked you, or if he had said I'm not interested, or he said that he doesn't like you, or he had just disappeared. The long silences, each time these echoes arose, stabilization required, that the requirement of stabilization was necessary, you know and that's when the metabolizing of these stages start to take form. So in other words, each of these echoes created more field stabilization. It creates more field stabilization. So from the old wounds resurfacing and memories that act as trigger, the rejection, the silences, the abandonment, they all start to come to the surface to be metabolized. So often you would move through a paradoxical stage. Even after your divine masculine returns, the grief of what has been lost would demand a little bit of healing, right? So stabilization was important. It's very important, and this is when you stop asking, why did he leave? You stop dwelling in the past and instead anchor into, how do you hold him now without fear he will leave again? This rebalancing reveals that his return was not to erase the past, but to redeem it through conscious presence in the present. So that's why, as the divine feminine, we anchor union first. Our role is not to micromanage his pace, but to embody the steadiness of the divine feminine, to show that the fire burns through without demand, without collapse, without fear. So when you hold ground, his nervous system will find safety again. So union begins to stabilize, not because our divine masculine changes overnight. That's total wishful thinking. But because you stop destabilizing every time he reflected uncertainty. Your steadiness becomes the magnet for his own. That's why when you walk in this phase where stabilization is continuous, union is not a one-time event. That's why I call it stable union. That's why it becomes practice. When our divine masculine returns again and again, each time more deeply, as long as the divine feminine, we sustain our embodiment. That's why stabilizing union is about trusting the third energy more than words or actions, recognizing the wobbles are not endings but recalibration, choosing the union frequency daily, even when the human story lags. So, this is how union stabilizes, not through perfection, but through resilience, not through fantasy, but through embodied soul alignment. So, I want to talk a bit about the mechanics of stabilization in union, the nervous system recalibration. When our divine masculine returns, both our bodies are flooded with mixed signals: safety, desire, fear, and memory. This is why the first stage of stabilization is not emotional but psychological. The divine masculine's body may still carry trauma from entanglements, karmic entanglements, from years of suppression, from his fear of losing himself in love, of being hurt, of being daunted. And and our body, the divine feminine's body, may carry abandonment imprints and vigilance patterns that expect him to vanish again. So we are like wondering, is this stable union? Union can't stabilize until both nervous systems stop treating each other as a threat. This requires conscious regulation, grounding, and a willingness to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. Collapsing old timelines. Every union carries the shadow of past breaks. Example, the divine masculine's words like, I'm not interested, I'll never speak to you again, do not simply disappear. They live in the body as cellular memory. Stabilization requires collapsing these old timelines. How? By refusing to rehearse them as a proof of rejection, by re-seeing them as initiation points, the very cracks through which the higher union light enters, by recognizing that these moments were his ego's voice, not his soul's. The more, as the divine feminine, we release our grip on the main story, the more our divine masculine can stop reenacting it. At first, union can feel like a pendulum swing. He steps forward, then pulls back. As the divine feminine, we urge to overextend, then we collapse. Stabilization is learning to hold the midpoint, not chasing when he retreats. So, for example, if my divine masculine needs space in the beginning of our union, I'll honor it. I would not let those old wounds of, what if this is another separation, or but no, this is when you surrender, not chasing when he retreats, not chasing when he's suddenly silent, or not chasing when you are like wondering what's going on in his mind or why he's. No, this is when, you show each other that both of you have changed, you see. Secondly, not shrinking when he advances. And thirdly, simply allowing the pendulum to slow until stillness becomes the new baseline. This is the alchemy of stabilization. Neutrality replacing reactivity. Union stabilizes not through constant fireworks, but through daily grounding. Our divine masculine does not return just to repeat a karmic romance. He returns to co-create a sacred, ordinary life with you, his divine wife. That's what our divine masculine does. He's co-creating. That's why I call it reunion. This means allowing conversations about mundane things without attaching them to the fear of loss, sharing space without needing it to be aesthetic every time, normalizing presence, the simple fact that he's here and I'm here and that is enough. You see, the reason why many unions don't stabilize is because the expectations are phenomenal. You want to do this. You go back into your wounded, performing, controlling. That's what a lot of divine feminines tend to do. And that's the reason why sometimes unions don't stabilize, until you learn how to normalize presence. So the sacred ordinary is the ultimate stabilizer because it proves union can withstand daily life. All right. As As the divine feminine, we lead stabilization not by doing more, but by just doing less from fear. Our leadership is energetic stillness. When we refuse to chase our divine masculine, he relaxes. When we refuse to weaponize our pain, he softens. When we don't bring up the past, he admires the strength. When we refuse to collapse, he grounds. The union frequency begins to hold because we have stopped shaking it every time his human self wavers. So that's why union is not achieved once he returns. That's why I always never use fixed words. I always say awakening. Union is always an endless adventure. Stabilization is a process of years, sometimes lifetimes, where the soul field grows strong enough to withstand 3D distortion. That's why the long view is essential. Today's argument is not proof of failure but proof of growth. Temporary distance is not abandonment but recalibration. Every wobble is part of stabilization against it. The long view prevents collapse into he's leaving again and anchors instead we are building forever. So that's why stabilizing union is not glamorous work. It is quiet daily, sometimes even frustrating, but it's also the deepest proof of love. Because when our divine masculine returns, the soul asks, can you hold him now without needing him to prove what you already know? That is stabilization, the end of needing proof and the beginning of living union. So, when our divine masculine first returns, the joy of reunion can mask how much stabilization actually demands. Union isn't instantly secure, it is tested, reflected, and matured through challenges. These challenges are not punishments, They are what you call proof points, designed to ensure the foundation is strong enough to hold. Even after our divine masculine's return, our divine masculine can experience moments where his ego flares. He may pull away, question his choices, or unconsciously sabotage intimacy. Why? Because union threatens the survival of his old self. For him, the ego whispers, what if I lose my freedom? What if she sees my flaws? For us, the ego would whisper, what if he leaves again? What if this isn't real? Stabilization means recognizing the flare ups for what they are, not truth but defense mechanism. Instead of reacting as divine feminines, we hold space, showing our divine masculine that love can outlast fear. So that's why when he returns, the ghosts of past cycles often reappear. So old karmic ties might resurface, old words may echo in our memory, even family or friends may remind him of why he once resisted the connection. Karmic echoes can destabilize if misunderstood, but in truth, they are reminders that healing is active. They surface so that you know, you and your DM can choose differently this time, to forgive, to stay present, to reframe. Every karmic echo is an opportunity to demonstrate growth. Union, especially at the monadic twin flame level, carries a frequency that draws both support and resistance. The divine masculine's return may trigger karmic partners intensifying their hold, friends or family questioning his choices, collective energies, retrogrades, eclipses, full moons, new moons, stirring chaos in the field. External interference is real, but stabilization comes when the pair learns to trust the frequency of union above outside noise. No third party is authority in a contract written before incarnation. So perhaps the greatest challenge lies in the feminine's own wound, hypervigilance. After cycles of abandonment, our body expects betrayal. It's too good to be true. You think that your DM is going to leave. Even small silences or neutral moments can trigger panic. breathlessness, panic attacks. If unchecked, the wound can destabilize union by reading danger when none exists. The stabilization task for us divine feminines is to hold our inner child with love, to soothe our fear without demanding our divine masculine to constantly prove safety. In parallel, in parallel, the divine masculine carries his own destabilizer, unworthiness. Facing the purity of our love, the divine feminine's love, he may feel he cannot live up to it. This can manifest as withdrawal, defensiveness, or sudden silence. So, as the divine feminine, we cannot fix this wound for him, but our embodiment of steady acceptance without lowering our standards, because the mirror that helps him rewrite his inner worth is the most necessary of it all. That's why the union field itself tests strength. It amplifies every shadow that could threaten stability. This is why reunions often feel turbulent. The field is purging instability before permanent anchoring. Infinite anchoring, in fact. The challenge is not to misinterpret turbulence as failure. Stabilization means seeing turbulence as proof that the field is working, clearing what cannot remain. So, the challenges of stabilizing union are not signs of weakness, but signs of depth. The deeper the connection, the more presence it must withstand. Each ego flare up, karmic echo, and external interference is an initiation, an invitation to respond differently, to grow stronger, and to prove that this union is not fragile fantasy but eternal truth. Stabilizing union is not about emotional maturity or communication skills. It's about consciously engaging the spiritual practices, technologies that the soul pair encoded long before incarnation. And these technologies, I like to call them technologies, are not man made. They are soul born mechanisms that help monadic twin flames hold their field steady when human patterns would otherwise collapse it. That's why we recognize these technologies all the time. At the core of stabilization is the third energy, the living field between you and your divine masculine. This field operates like a stabilizing grid. When he wavers, the field absorbs the shock. When you fear, the field neutralizes the charge. When both of you hold presence, the field expands, waving stability that neither could sustain alone. The third energy grid functions like scaffolding, ensuring that your union does not fall apart during testing but instead strengthens under pressure. That's why twin flames, we are natural grid workers. I've been talking about that so much lately. When stabilizing union, we are often called consciously or unconsciously to specific locations, and these are not random. They are points on earth where the union frequency can anchor into planetary grids. Sacred sites, ley lines, or natural power spots amplify stability. Even mundane spaces, a shared home, a family cafe, a workplace corridor, can become stabilization nodes. Once your frequency imprints into the field, every encounter plants an anchor, creating a web of stability across timelines. This is why separation and reunions often coincide with travel, relocation, or sudden pull towards sacred geography. I love geography, by the way. So, union stabilization is not limited to 3D presence. I want you guys to understand that very, very clearly. The astral body plays a central role. So, dream contact allows unresolved energies to be rehearsed and healed in a safer terrain. Etheric love making recalibrates nervous system, transmitting safety through subtle body intimacy. Soul dialogues, you know, anchor clarity before the human self can articulate it. So these etheric technologies stabilize union by ensuring the field remains alive even when the human interaction may be imperfect. So, stabilization requires frequency alignment. Simple but profound technologies like sound act as tuning forks, breathing and sounds, right? So when both you and your divine masculine breathe consciously in each other's presence, your nervous systems harmonize. That's what happens, all right? Music, mantras, or even silence can reset the field after turbulence. The resonance of voice, this is a huge thing, our divine masculine's tone, our frequency. It's not casual, it's an instrument of soul level regulation. Union stabilizes when sound and breath become conscious tools rather than unconscious trigger. That's why spiritual technology is not only cosmic, stabilization is built through rituals woven into ordinary life. Sharing a meal becomes a ritual of grounding, taking care of each other in the mornings, taking turns to help make breakfast, things like that, sharing a meal, making breakfast together, lighting a candle together, anchor slide into the field, touching your divine masculine's hand, our DM holding our gaze, each act as a micro ritual that affirms safety. These sacred ordinaries are real technologies that turn union from theory into living reality. So, stabilization cannot be separated from collective timelines. Eclipses, retrogrades, portals act as accelerators, and stress tests. Twin flames are not victims of these energies, but custodians. That's why 8, 8, 10, 10 portals, 11, 11, 12, 12, 9, 9 portals, 13, 1 portals, 14, 2, 15, 3. When they stabilize, when you stabilize union, when you stabilize your union field during these collective storms, they not only help you to secure your bond, but also transmit stability outward, becoming nodal points of balance for others in the collective. So, the greatest question after reunion is, how do I know if our union is stabilizing? In the early stages, it's easy to confuse temporary peace with true stability. So, hear me out very carefully here. But stabilization carries very distinct markers, energetic, emotional, and practical, that reveal when the field is anchored beyond fragility. So, the nervous system holds steady. The most obvious sign is nervous system regulation. Example, our divine masculine goes out, he's late, and as the divine feminine, you no longer spiral into panic. You trust he will return. Example, when as the divine feminine we start crying, our divine masculine no longer retreats in overwhelm. He hears you. Both bodies begin to rest in each other's presence, even in silence. Union stabilizes when the body stops bracing for abandonment and begins to trust the baseline of presence. So that's why you have fewer collapses and faster recoveries. Stabilization doesn't mean no triggers. It means that when triggers arise, collapses are shorter and recoveries are faster. Arguments that once took weeks to repair now dissolve in hours. Misunderstanding that used to cause separation now invite conversation. The field itself self heals, pulling both you and your DM back to balance. This is the field maturing. Turbulence no longer threatens union but strengthens it. That's why in her early union, you have to recognize this. The past haunts. Words like I'm not interested, or him rejecting you or blocking you will replay endlessly on your mind. And our divine masculine may still carry guilt or shame for his behavior. So stabilization shows itself when these echoes arise but no longer sting. They are remembered without collapse, seen as stepping stones instead of scars. The detachment is proof the field has integrated what once destabilized it. So at first, both may crave intensity, all right? So often, that's how we feel, right? proof, fireworks, constant reassurance, but stabilization feels different. The sacred ordinary becomes enough. Sharing space in silence feels full, not empty. Like you no longer need your divine masculine to talk all the time, or you don't need the need to like feel the silence all the time. You see, daily life, meals, errands, resting together, becoming a constant container of safety. The need for constant romantic evidence fades away, replaced by simple presence. So, this is the soul showing that love does not need performance to exist. So, all those external interferences weaken karmic partners, family opinions, toxic friends, external stresses, once destabilized union with ease. They will all disappear. In stabilization, their influence wanes. The masculine no longer defaults to other voices over yours. As the divine feminine, we are no longer threatened by karmic interference, but instinctively protect the union field as sacred ground. External noise may still exist, but it no longer has to prove to uproot what has been anchored. The ultimate sign of stabilization is third energy growth. Creative projects without force, shared mission, impulses arise to teach, travel, to heal, to serve. Even in separation phases, the union field continues to strengthen instead of weaken. When the third energy is alive, the union is no longer about survival, it becomes expansion. So that's why the stabilization does not mean the end of challenges, all right? It means the challenges no longer threaten union itself. The divine masculine and us, the divine feminines, begin to live not in constant proof seeking, but in quiet trust. And the love becomes less about holding on and more about growing together, which I keep talking about. This is when union has stabilized, not when it's perfect, but when it's resilient. So, stabilizing union is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning. I always say union is just the beginning. That's why it's never happily ever after, and you don't have the end. It's a happily ever after and beyond. So that's why in early reunion, every interaction revolves around reassurance, right? Like, do you love me? Are you staying? Will you leave again? But once stabilization matures, these questions fall away. The focus shifts outward. Together, you begin asking, what healing are we meant to offer each other? How do we anchor our love into something larger than us? What are we supposed to do for the world? What is the legacy of our union on earth? Union stabilizes when love no longer needs constant proof and instead becomes a foundation for creation. So mission does not appear as a sudden grand plan, but as threads of shared vision. The divine masculine feels drawn to build, protect, and innovate, and as the divine feminine, we feel drawn to nurture, guide, and transmit wisdom. All right, our third energy, our union energy, magnetizes opportunities that reflect both gifts. The vision is not always immediate, but the impulse to co create begins pushing stronger the impulse to self protect. So a stabilized union naturally spills over. Our field becomes medicine, inspiration for others. Family wounds begin to resolve through our example. Friends feel peace simply by being in our presence. Even strangers sense the coherence of the field. Isn't that amazing? So this is not performance, it's resonance. It's resonance. Stabilized union radiates because it no longer collapses inward. Mission is not carried by either individual, it's carried by the third energy. So you got to remember this very, very clearly and carefully. Join projects, you may be teaching, writing, healing, creating a play together, community building, or even something seemingly simple like raising a family with higher consciousness. The third energy becomes the child of the union, the living embodiment of what our love was meant to birth. This shared creation stabilizes us further because now we have an external anchor bigger than our own personal fears. So, for monadic twin flames, missions is not. You see, for magnetic twin flames, missions extend beyond Earth. Stabilized union often awakens soul memory of starseed service, great work at sacred sites, anchoring higher frequencies during cosmic alignments, serving as planetary stabilizers during collective turbulence. Union is just not about personal fulfillment, it's about planetary architecture. When stabilized, you know, both us and our divine masculine are no longer tossed around by collective chaos but act as nodal points of coherence. So the final fruit of stabilization is legacy, not legacy as in fame, but legacy as in frequency, So the children that we have carry the imprints of our unconditional love. Our children, you know, their creations ripple through timelines, healing distortion. Presence becomes testimony, and that true union is possible. So that's why stabilized union leaves behind a resonance field that outlives the human story. So that's the reason why, when our divine masculine returns, it's not about romance alone, it's about the reactivation of our soul adventure return on the magnetic twin flame level. So stabilization turn that return into a foundation, and mission now turns the foundation into a legacy. So the truth is this: once union stabilizes, it stops asking why us and starts answering for them. Union is not just for the lovers, it is for the world. With that, I hope you have enjoyed today's discourse. It was not meant to be this long, but when I go with the flow, I just keep going with the flow. So with that, share your experience, and if you guys want to work one-on-one with me, you can book my session in the link provided in the description. And all my sessions are conducted by me live via Zoom, so you can ask me as many questions as you want during our session, and I will answer them all for you. And I've also listed, I've introduced a few new more healings and activations. Do check them out on my website. With that, I will see you all again. Blessings always. Take care and bye bye.